Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining our California Coastal Resilience Network webinar today. My name is Carrie Boyle, and I help coordinate the network as a State Sea Grant Fellow with the Coastal Conservancy. I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but I wanted to start off with just a few housekeeping announcements in case any of you are new to this GoToWebinar interface. We will have time at the end for our speakers to answer any questions you might have, so please type those up in the questions box, and we'll address them later on in today's session. This webinar is being recorded, and I'll send you a link to that in a follow-up email to everyone who's signed up. I've also included a few URLs in the welcome message that hopefully you saw when you first logged on. Our speakers will be addressing those as they speak, and I'll include those links in a follow-up email as well. So today's webinar is about coastal ecosystems and equity, exploring the intersection in Los Angeles and Santa Cruz. And we have a wonderful set of speakers today. If you could advance the next slide, Giuliano. Wonderful. So Alyssa Man is the Project Director for Disaster Resilience at the Nature Conservancy. She's based in LA, and she manages the Nature Conservancy's Climate Adaptation Demonstration projects. Next, we'll have Giuliano Khalil, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for the Blue Economy, an Adjunct Professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, and the founder of Virtual Planet Technologies. He specializes in multidisciplinary approaches to inspire equitable climate adaptation projects. So Giuliano and Alyssa will discuss the results of the Coastal Resilience Los Angeles project, and Giuliano will also briefly review recent work done in the City of Santa Cruz. So we're happy to be joined by Tiffany Wise, the Sustainability and Climate Action Manager for the City of Santa Cruz. And she'll be on the line to help answer any questions that might come up about the work done in Santa Cruz. So thank you so much to the three of you for joining us today. And with that, I'll hand it off to Alyssa and Giuliano.
Thanks so much, Carrie. Hi, everybody. Happy to be with you today. Again, my name is Alyssa Man. I'm a Project Director for Disaster Resilience for the California chapter of the Nature Conservancy. I'm going to speak today to all of you about our Coastal Resilience Los Angeles project that was really focused on exploring the question of whether the potential loss of coastal habitat due to climate change might have a disproportionate impact on communities that are already disproportionately impacted by pollution burdens, income disparities, adverse health impacts. Specifically, this project focused on developing a method for understanding and visualizing the multifaceted issues related to equity and the relationship to coastal vulnerability and adaptation. Can you guys hear me okay? Carrie, wanted to check my audio's okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, next slide, Giuliano. Thanks. Wanted to give a quick shout out to the team that worked on this project. This project was really the brainchild of Dr. Giuliano Khalil, who will dig into the results and the mapping portal today, as well as Lily Verdone, who is now with the Texas chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Also instrumental to the team was Sarah Newkirk, Dr. Walter Hetty, and Charlotte Piancos of TNC, as well as Dr. Barry Nickel, who developed the online app, and Linda Chilton from USCC Grant, who provided really invaluable guidance and advice in helping us to bring in stakeholders to the process. Okay, next slide. So as many of you know, research is showing us that climate change impacts are often disproportionately distributed across populations. Some populations, particularly those that experience social inequities, are less able to prepare, respond to, and recover from extreme events and chronic stressors. In the LA region, the most vulnerable communities tend to be more inland neighborhoods. However, the coastal zone is not immune to some of these issues. Next slide. It has also been well documented the beneficial link of nature and people. Healthy coastal ecosystems provide a myriad of benefits to people and human well-being, both social, economic, and ecological. In Los Angeles as well, the coast is really important and essential to many communities throughout the county, and not just those that own a property adjacent. It's important for coastal jobs, recreation, fishing, education. We know anecdotally that people come from far inland to enjoy the coast on a regular basis, fish for their families and their way of life, and drive really far distances to jobs that are coastal dependent. And so this is really where the Coastal Resilience project, it sought to explore some of these issues. Next slide. So again, our objective for this project was to develop an approach for understanding and visualizing the multifaceted issues related to equity and their relationship to coastal vulnerability and adaptation. We had a number of interest areas going into this project, which you can see some of them here. I'll say here that really we found that there really is a need for reliable data to support analyses for some of these topics, especially recreation, and it's needed for further study. What we found in terms of data was that for some of these areas, data either were not available for the LA region, were unreliable, didn't have the right spatial resolution required for the analysis. We were really looking at sort of the census tract or below. As a result, we honed in on two topics, coastal access and coastal jobs, where we found that there really was some great data at the relevant scale and resolution. Next slide. So these were the steps for the project. First, we updated the results for the California Conservation Assessment. This was an assessment of sea level rise vulnerability for coastal habitats across the state. I'll get a bit more into the details of that study in a minute. Coastal Resilience Los Angeles was initiated as a parallel to this assessment, and these were sort of the basic steps we took. We first updated the coastal assessment with the new U.S. Geological Survey's Coastal Storm Modeling System 3.0. Those were really right off the presses at the time and actively being used by local governments. We reviewed the literature out there and looked for available data in LA for our interest areas. As I mentioned before, we found that there really wasn't enough data to get at the full suite of our interests. And so really more is needed to really pull apart this onion. But we were able to find some great studies and data sets on coastal jobs and coastal access. And then we convened focus groups during the project to get stakeholder and partner insights about what issues were important to them, what would be helpful from their perspective, and any data that may be available for LA. And then we conducted the analysis and mapped the results, and finally put the results up on our online tool called Coastal Resilience. Next slide. So before I turn it over to Giuliano to talk about some of the socioeconomic analyses, let me first give you a little bit of information about the parallel study that was really the base for this work. Last year, the Nature Conservancy and the State Coastal Conservancy released the first California statewide comprehensive assessment of the vulnerability of habitats, imperiled species, and conservation lands to sea level rise. Walter Hetty and I did a presentation to this network a number of months ago. I think that's recorded, and you can look at it there to dig a little bit more into the details. And I invite you to check out the study itself on our Coastal Resilience California website, as well as explore the results for Los Angeles on our mapping portal. But I'm just going to give you a couple quick highlights. So there have been a number of studies that looked at the impact of storms and rising seas on coastal infrastructure and property, but not looking across the state at the vulnerability to our coastal habitats, our beaches, our dunes, wetlands, marsh, rocky intertidal habitat, and more. So this 2-year project mapped the current location of over 40 habitat types, looked at the vulnerability of those habitats at both 2 and 5 feet of sea level rise, and then mapped strategies available to address that risk. And the result is a wall-to-wall conservation blueprint down to the resolution of 1 square kilometer for the entire California coast. Next slide. So this is the bad news. With 5 feet of sea level rise, the coast of tomorrow will not look like today's coast. There's really quite a bit of vulnerability up and down the coast. At 5 feet of sea level rise, 59% of California's coastal habitats are highly vulnerable. 39 rare, threatened, and endangered species are highly vulnerable, many of which are unique to the coast. 41,000 acres of already conserved land are projected to be drowned by subtidal waters. And so that means the very investments in conservation that we have collectively made over the years are under threat. Next slide. But here's the good news. There's hope. Our study found that with sustained and coordinated effort, we can have as much or more coastal habitat with 5 feet of sea level rise as we have today. ensuring that our children and grandchildren can enjoy the remarkable benefits provided by our incredible coast. Equipped with a path to this vision, the Nature Conservancy launched what we call the Hope for the Coast Initiative, which is a growing, strong coalition of federal, state, and local coastal leaders that are making concrete commitments to maintain and protect our coastal habitats. And the most recent to join was Los Angeles County, with the Board of Supervisors passing a motion just a couple of weeks ago, adopting the vision and directing the Chief Sustainability Officer to address these issues in the county's first sustainability plan, which is currently underway. Next slide. So I want to give you a bit more detail about what the coastal assessment means for Los Angeles. One big message is this. There's not a lot of habitat left in the county, and what's left, there's a lot of risk. There's only about 4.5 square miles of habitat left across 40 different habitat types, 57% of which is highly vulnerable at 5 feet of sea level rise. Next slide. And to illustrate this, here are some of the LA specific results from the coastal assessment. It's a bit tough to see, but on the left you can, we have the different habitat types. Each top bar of each section is the area for the whole of Southern California, and below is just LA County. Without getting into too much of the details, green is more resilient to sea level rise and red is more vulnerable. What makes Los Angeles a bit different, particularly from other South Coast counties and as well as statewide, is there's not a lot of coastal habitats left. This underscores how important it is to maintain and enhance what we currently have. And then one more slide. So I couldn't end today without talking a little bit about beaches. In LA, our beaches are really an important resource for this region. LA has a lot of vulnerable beaches. If you look by area of kind of upper Sandy Beach, 89% is highly vulnerable. If you look at coastal access, of the 40 sandy beaches with facilities, 35 of those are considered highly vulnerable to sea level rise. And then when you look at strategies to address the risk of coastal habitats here in LA, because we're so developed, adapting the built environment in a way that also benefits habitat will be so important. We really need to take into account adjacent habitat while we're also addressing risk to our infrastructure. That may be doing things like, for example, raising our roads so that there's hydrological connection, or it may mean in some cases retreating away from the coast and getting things out of harm's way, which also provides more space for habitats to migrate. There's over 10 square kilometers of exposed built environment in LA County, so that's a lot of opportunity for us to look at some of these issues. We can also make inroads with some of the other strategies as well by conserving both resilient and vulnerable habitat, as well as protecting what we call potential future habitat, which is kind of where habitat could be if we enabled that transition as sea levels rise. But with that, I will turn over the talk to Dr. Giuliano Khalil, who will talk about the socioeconomic issues as they relate to coastal habitat vulnerability. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Alyssa. Thank you, Carrie and the network for providing this opportunity for us to share this project and a little bit about the work in Santa Cruz as well. So I will talk a little bit about the two components that Alyssa mentioned, how we included, social vulnerability in our study. Talk about jobs and coastal access. I'll share a little bit about some of those lessons learned that we had through the project. Then I'll switch over and do a very brief demonstration of our app. And then I will talk how we, explain a little bit of how we included social vulnerability in the latest Climate Adaptation Plan update here in Santa Cruz. So the first step in the project is like, how do we track, social vulnerability in the county? And we reviewed multiple studies, I think, over 70 different studies and papers on social vulnerability related to sea level rise and climate and other things. But after reviewing many of them and talking to some local folks, and since Calvary Screen 3.0 and disadvantaged communities data in LA started to be, more widespread used, we decided to go with that. And analyzing that data, we found that half of all disadvantaged communities in California are located in LA County, and almost half of the population in the county live in areas or census tracts. That's how that scale is tracked, that are considered disadvantaged communities as well. So a lot of those are not on the coast, with some exceptions. In LA, actually, there's some, San Pedro, Wilmington, and parts of Long Beach. But if you look throughout the state, they're not as close to the coast. And another reason why we decided to use Cal Enviro screen data is because it's tied with funding from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, so GGRF. That's from the cap and trade permit scheme. So as of November of 2017, there were about $2 billion in funds that were implemented, and half of that, a little over $1 billion, were funded for projects that benefited disadvantaged communities, and 30% of the funds were in projects located within those disadvantaged communities. Now, we are, to date, we're not aware of any of this funding is actually being used for climate coastal adaptation, but I found some projects where they use the funds in fuel reduction projects, and they protected over, I think they said 1.4 million acres of California forest land. So next step on the project was to look at the jobs data, and this is a resource I'm kind of excited to share with you. A lot of people don't know about this. I hope some of you do, and if you don't, I highly recommend you take a look at this after the webinar. So this is a census website called On the Map that they did a very detailed analysis. It's all over the United States, looking where people live and where they work. And this is actually very detailed. Some of the results are at the block level, which is pretty amazing. And you can select the geography. You can do some sorts of pair analysis, as I'll show in my next slide. And it's a very valuable resource. So I highly recommend you can use this for many, many different projects. So the pair analysis, as I just mentioned. So what I did, and what you see here is the red polygons. Here are all the census tracts in LA County, which are designated as disadvantaged communities. And the blue area is what we use as the coastal area in our project. It's kind of a loose definition. We just use, the tracts that are roughly south of the 405 freeway. And the pair analysis showed us, attributes and characteristics of the jobs in the coastal zone, which are held by the residents of disadvantaged communities in the county. And what you see here is the results of those that analysis. You can see there's a heat map on the coast, and the red areas are areas of higher concentration of jobs, and these results are filtered by extremely low-paying jobs, so you can sort those by earnings as well. So these jobs are jobs that pay $1,250 per month or less, so extremely low-paying. And we found that over 30% of all coastal jobs are held by residents of disadvantaged communities, and about 40% of them are either extremely low paying or very low paying. Very low paying jobs are jobs that pay $3,333 per month or less. And the extremely low paying, as I mentioned, is $1,250 per month or less. And we found a few spots, like hot spots of concentration of jobs. One of the things we found too is that the low-paying, extremely low-paying jobs, they concentrate where most of the jobs concentrate. And we found these 4 hotspots: so Santa Monica, the LAX airport and close areas, Torrance, and then Long Beach. So we decided to add to our project 2 case studies, and you can find them in the tool that I'll show. But I just want to share some results from the Long Beach case study. So in Long Beach, and this is kind of the color scheme that we use on the app, where the dark blue, it's like a high concentration of jobs. And here it's again filtered by extremely low paying jobs. So 40% of all jobs in Long Beach are held by residents of disadvantaged communities, and about half of those jobs pay $3,300 per month or less. One other interesting thing that you can do with the On the Map website is another analysis where you look at distance travel to work. So you can look at a location and see how far people commute from, what direction they come from, what cities they live in. So we found that in Long Beach, about half of workers travel more than 10 miles for their job. And I think we're all familiar with LA, 10 miles one way commute in LA, it could take you a really long time to get to work. So next, we looked at equitable coastal access. So we had a couple of, Alyssa mentioned a couple of focus groups. And part of the feedback we got is that coastal access in California is not equitable. I think we, again, kind of know that, but disadvantaged communities are located further to coastal access. And one of the things we heard over and over is that the lack of public transportation and also high costs of parking prevent many residents from accessing the coast. So I want to share a graph from our colleague, Joshua Morris. He's working on a publication for this, but he gave me permission to share with you guys some of his results. So what he did was he mapped distance to the coast on the y-axis with median income on the x-axis. So what you can see, this blue line is for the whole state of California. So there's a very strong correlation. So the further or the more money you make, so 100% is the wealthiest income, the closest you're likely to live to the coast. When he looked at some of this data for Los Angeles County, which is the orange line, that is not as significant, but it's still significant. And the main reason is because of some of those communities that I mentioned before. So areas of San Pedro, Wilmington, and areas of Long Beach as well. So he's working on a manuscript, so look for that in the next few months. So what we did in our app for coastal access is we use Joshua's data. And what you see here on the right are all the census tracts in the county, and they're color-coded by median income. So red is lowest and green is the highest income. And when you click on any tract, it will show you a line connecting that tract with the closest coastal access point, which is a sandy beach, with parking and restrooms. And it will show you the median income for the tract, the distance, and also the average distance in the county of all tracts to a coastal access. So some of the lessons learned through the project. A big one is that community engagement should happen much sooner. I think this is a common theme. And I don't know, I hope some of you guys had an opportunity to watch another webinar, I think it was last week or the week before, which is on meaningful community engagement, case studies from the Coastal Conservancy, where some folks shared their experiences with community engagement and some successful stories. I highly recommend, I think that's recorded as well. If you're interested on this, you should definitely check that out. The other thing we learned is that partnerships take time. It takes time to build trust, and you do need those partnerships. Terminology matters, so that was a big one for us. One of the first things we did on our engagement workshop was really to have an open conversation about this. How do you refer to some of these communities that we want to engage with, and some of these more vulnerable groups. Even the term disadvantaged communities, I'm not a huge fan of it, but when you look at some of the reports that are coming out from GGRF and even from the Coastal Commission, we're hearing more and reading more about priority populations and some other terms that are, I think, more appropriate. One thing we've been strongly advised to steer away is from the word underserved. So avoid underserved communities if you can. That's not a preferred term. And on the data, I think Alyssa mentioned this as well, we really need higher resolution and more frequent data on a lot of these things. Even recreation, we thought we would have access to some better data and more detail, but a lot of the surveys, they don't track folks at like from their address or a census tract. I think the most I've seen was at the what county or city that they come from. Data on fisheries, education, and another thing we're really interested in the beginning of the project was gentrification and affordable housing. But that's happening so fast in some areas that we couldn't track as well. But we're hoping to get more data too. All right, so I will switch gears a little bit here, and I will transition to the online web tool and show you what we built with. All right, so can you guys see the website, coastalresilience.org?
Yes.
Okay, great. So to get to our app, you go to coastalresilience.org, and then you click on the mapping portal. And under United States, you can click in California, and then you can open the map. You can also go straight to maps.coastalresilience.org, California. And on the left-hand side, this is what we call like plugins. So there's one, ours is the third one from the top, so disadvantaged communities and coastal habitat. So we kind of number the components of the project 1 through 5. You don't need to follow that order. Feel free to explore it, you know, in any order you like. One of the things that we are kind of very happy to have here is the results of the coastal assessment from TNC. So this is the first place where you can actually interact with some of this, with the habitats. So if I log in here, so say Bayona Creek, there is a legend. You can look at different coastal habitats and expand it. But you can also look at some of the conservation strategies, which Alyssa was mentioning before, in an interactive way, and you can kind of navigate through the whole county and look at some of some really good and very highly detailed data. And then you can choose to either leave that on or turn it off as a background on the map. So if I go back to a county, more county scale, you can learn about coastal jobs. So here's that concentration of coastal jobs that I mentioned. Dark blue again is high concentration of jobs. There's some statistics that pop up here on the left side. And you can also slide this bar to look at concentration of jobs according to earnings, like $1,250 per month or less, between $1,250 and $3,300, and so forth. And as I mentioned, one of the things that we found is that the high concentration of jobs, the low-paying jobs, kind of follow the, you know, where all the jobs are. And you have an option too to just look at jobs which are held by residents of disadvantaged communities and how they concentrate and how, and you can also look at it by earnings by using the sliding bar on the left side. One of the features that I kind of find great to have here is this option of look at jobs at census block level. So that's pretty very, very high resolution. So if you go to a block here in, let's say, Santa Monica, and you click on it, it actually tells you the total number of jobs in that block and how much or how many jobs according to earnings category. So it's a very, very detailed data. Next, let me show you the coastal axis. So this is the same image I had on the PowerPoint. So you can see the coastal, the census tracts for the whole county. And now you're looking at color coded by median income per household. So dark blue is lowest median income. So if I click on a tract, the legend, it tells you the median income for that tract, and then what the closest coastal access point is. That again with facilities, right, with the parking and the restrooms, and then it tells you the average distance or the distance to that point, and then on the bottom, on the left here, you can see other statistics. And finally, you can also learn more about disadvantaged communities in the county. So we have the jobs data here, similar to what we had about coastal jobs. Now you can see the jobs or attributes and concentration of jobs based where folks live now instead of where they work. So And you can focus on environmental health. So this is the CalEnviro screen data now showing the percentile scores. And dark blue is the highest scores on CalEnviro screen. And all the communities that are on the top 75% of CalEnviro screen scores are considered disadvantaged communities. So you can click on them, and then it will show you the percentile, so 98.1, so it's really high. You can see the population. And also, if you look on the left, CalEnviro screen 3.0 is a combination as an average between a pollution burden score and a population characteristics. So you can also click on each one of this and then select a tract, and it will show you the indicators within that. So the population again, and now the pollution burden, so things like ozone, traffic, water quality, solid waste, and other things. And similarly, you can look at population characteristics from CalEnviro screen, and I will tell you some health indicators and some socioeconomics as well. And just to finalize this quick demo, there's this little thing on the bottom here, opacity, so you can kind of make the layers that you're looking at transparent. So if you choose to go back and insert coastal habitats, for instance, you can work with that opacity to be able to see what's in the background. All right, so we'll leave our emails with you guys too. So we look forward to some feedback, and then if you have any questions, we'll be happy to help you through the tool. And we're really interested in seeing how folks use it. One of the things we're hoping that this might drive some partnerships between inland and coastal communities with focus of strengthening those relationships, with a focus in alleviating some of the socioeconomic issues, but also providing value through coastal access and healthy coastal habitats. All right, so I will switch gears again now and go over another project, and I'm kind of happy we're able to talk about these two projects back to back, because this issue of which scale you need to, how do you track social vulnerability at different scales? It's something that I find very interesting, and it's clearly not one size fits all. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we incorporated social vulnerability in the latest update of the City of Santa Cruz Climate Adaptation Plan. And just a reminder that Tiffany Wise is on the line as well. She's kind enough to join us and is available to if you have more questions about the plan. So we'll have a time at the end for that. But before I talk about the project, I just want to give a quick shout out for the American Geophysics Union, EGU. This is how I got connected with Tiffany in the first place. So this is they have a program called Thriving Earth Exchange. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you take a look at it. But basically, a community can apply for a project, and the community gets paired up with a scientist or a little team of scientists that help them with a project. And the great news is that it's free. So the scientists that join this program, we kind of volunteer our time for the projects, and the city doesn't have to pay for it. So the team that did the part of the social vulnerability scores here that I'll show you. So Tiffany was a community lead. I was kind of the scientist doing most of the work, but Dr. Ben Preston, he works at the RAND Corporation in Santa Cruz. He was kind of our senior advisor here for our approach, and kind of an internal kind of peer review process as well. So I've been talking about vulnerability. I just want to quickly define what I mean by that, and this is a definition that I use in most of my work. It's really this capacity of a community to anticipate, cope with, resist, or recover from hazards. And there, study after study shows that vulnerable groups, including the poor, elderly, and disabled, suffer disproportionate impacts from natural hazards. And they're usually located in high-risk areas, lack basic resources, including insurance. They take much longer to recover, and there's this cycle where disasters reduce income and consumption, and that further aggravates poverty. So some folks that can't get to work for whatever reason for a couple of weeks, they might be evicted because they can't afford to pay their rent. So we're interested in understanding how that would play a role in Santa Cruz. So what we did for the climate adaptation update was first, like what we did in Los Angeles, we did a review of pre-existing vulnerability indices. So how do we map and categorize vulnerability in the city? And then we overlapped those results with, the hazards that were included in the climate plan. And again, we looked at the CalEnviro Screen 3.0 data and also the Social Vulnerability Index, or SOVI, which was developed by Suzanne Cutter's team at the University of South Carolina. But the issue that we had are twofold here, the issues. One, if you look at here maybe on the right, you can see these are big areas that are really at the census tracts, because the population in Santa Cruz is not nearly as large as some other urban centers. Our census tracts are really, really wide. And we know there are some pockets of low income areas in the city, but they were diluted when you look at the whole tract. And also CalEnviro Screen and even SOVI, it's at a statewide comparison. So when we look at CalEnviro Screen for Santa Cruz, we don't have any designated disadvantaged communities. So the studies were either too low resolution, or in many cases, it was really hard to tie the results with the clear adaptation alternatives. So when you look at SOVI, for instance, you have even areas that it's a medium. To really understand what's driving that medium score, you have to dig through some complicated statistics, and it's not a clear cut. So as a result of that, we decided to create our own vulnerability scores. And the way we did it is that we used income, so households that make less than $60,000 per year, which is kind of close to the median income for the county. Elderly, so folks that are 65 years old or older. Linguistic isolation, so folks that speak English not well or not at all, is how that's described. Disability, and then also high crime rates, or serious crime is what we focus on. So we put it all together, we rank them and average those scores for each one of the city blocks, block groups, sorry, and then you have a much more detailed picture of what that looks like for the city. And we knew, for instance, there's some areas, if you're familiar with Santa Cruz, around here behind the boardwalk, where it's like the beach flats, and then the lower ocean. So we knew those were kind of pockets of low income neighborhoods. There's some areas of high crimes in there as well. But with the other indicators, we're able to get a more robust picture. And I'll talk a little bit more, about how we can use some of this data in a few slides. So the next step was to look at, okay, we have the scores, and now I'm overlaying that with coastal flooding. So there's two scenarios here, like dark blue and kind of light blue. But if you look at the blue area, it's projected flooding resulting from 2.4 feet of sea level rise on top of a 100-year storm. So, and this is where we kind of, again, you kind of have a feeling how these things go, but now you can clearly see that the areas that are the most exposed to flooding, according to sea level rise and coastal storms, are either medium high or high vulnerability scores. So, and I kind of have the sense, there's some anecdotal data and some studies, that have been done recently, but I have the feeling there are many areas like this in the state that haven't been mapped yet. I know BCDC did a great study in the Bay Area. There's some great studies in LA, but I think we still need to focus on this a little bit more. And I was reading one of the recent reports from the Coastal Commission. They found that most of the sea level rise vulnerability assessment done in California still ignore socioeconomics. So we're going to make sure that we include that as going forward. But we also overlaid that socioeconomic scores with tsunami risk, and again, it's like smack down kind of medium high and high vulnerability is the folks more vulnerable in case a big tsunami hits the city. We also did for fire hazard, and there's some more inland and uphill areas here, but it's also kind of medium high vulnerability. And just to, in conclusion, I just want to say one way that we're happy that we kept all those indicators of vulnerability kind of close to the scores, because, and sorry that these numbers, they don't mean anything, but these are the designations of each one of the census block groups that we have in the city. And I think Tiffany is working on assigning the actual neighborhood names to some of this to make it more clear. But what I want to point out is that if you look at one, and I just chose this one here, 0006, you can actually see what indicators are driving that high vulnerability for that block group. So in this case, age, disability, income, and language are all the highest in comparison, but crime is not as strong as some other areas. And by looking at each one of those, you can find, patterns of vulnerability. And then when you're planning a strategy to reduce some of those vulnerabilities, you don't need to apply the same strategy to the entire city. You can focus on the drivers on specific neighborhoods. And a couple of things, we haven't done a detailed analysis yet, but one of the preliminary findings is that there are some areas in Santa Cruz that are the drivers of vulnerability are age, disability, and income. So it's a lot of pockets of retired folks on fixed income that are vulnerable as well. And there are some other areas where income, language, and crime are the drivers. So you can think of different strategies for different locations based on that. And I think I'll leave it at that, and then we'll have some more time for discussion. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Giuliano. So folks on the line, if you have any questions, please feel free to type those into the questions pane. We have one that came in already from Sumi. She's wondering, were homeless populations considered in the disadvantaged community analysis and access to ecosystem services? And at this point, I think we are talking about Los Angeles, so I think that's what that question is about. And if homeless populations were considered, what data sources or groups did you speak with to learn more about the homeless population? If they were not considered, what was the reasoning behind that decision?
Right, I can start with that, and that actually it's applicable to both, Santa Cruz and LA County, because we also have a significant homeless population here, and we did not include it. And the main reason was because we couldn't, there was not clear data available, but also the methods were, I looked through the literature, and this is a very emerging discussion as far as how do you track some of these things. I just want to point out, I was looking at the National Adaptation Forum website this morning, and there's a webinar that's being planned that's going to tackle that issue. So I just sign up, and I recommend you look it up to see. But I don't know if Alyssa and Tiffany want to add anything to that.
Do you guys hear me? Oh, go ahead, Tiffany.
Yeah, this is Tiffany, and this is actually a question I get asked a lot. And as Giuliano mentioned, we don't really have geospatial data for our homeless populations, unfortunately. And, in a way, poverty could potentially act as a proxy, but not, matched very closely. So that's something we have our eye on in taking this work further, particularly in two coastal resilience projects that we have funded, one by Caltrans and one by the Coastal Commission, that are starting very soon. So we definitely will be addressing that in those projects and basing it on this work that we did with Giuliano.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I mean, that's something we've been really interested, even from the time before I was at the Nature Conservancy, when I was at USCC grant, was looking at homeless in LA. And I think when we did this study, as well as the prior one with Sea Grant, I don't think there was data available, although that's changing. The city has new data available, and we'll have to dig into that. But obviously this was a county project, and so we didn't have it across the entire county. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting and important issue, particularly here in LA. And that's, particularly like the Venice community and some of the places like that may pop more than they do on say, Calvira Street.
Great, thanks for answering that. I don't see many more questions coming in, but I will ask a question. So I'm wondering, and this could be a question for all three of you, what you envision the future direction of this work being. Maybe Tiffany, you could touch on how the City of Santa Cruz will use, or maybe they've already used, the social vulnerability scores in their work. Just wondering if you could touch on that for a bit.
Yeah, definitely. So this has really initiated a conversation, particularly around our emergency services. I have had discussions with our fire chief about our reverse 911 calls and how we can ensure that these particular census block groups get reverse 911 calls in both English and Spanish. So that's something that we're working on, as well as more broadly, any communications regarding climate risks and flooding being bilingual. So that's something that we are definitely integrating into our processes. You know, the other piece with respect to emergency services is, you know, wildfire. We have, next to some of our open spaces, we have some of these elderly populations who clearly have mobility issues. And when I went to revisit this topic, when we kind of rediscovered this through this study, I revisited this with our emergency services folks and, you know, took a look at the routing of their emergency vehicles under different cases. And this is information that they already knew. So that was kind of a good check for us to look at. Their routing goes to old folks' homes and senior living communities. They route there first for different emergencies. So I have to admit, we really have only just begun to scratch the surface of the utility of this kind of work. And as I said before, I'm looking forward to fleshing this out a little bit more in our upcoming Resilient Coast Santa Cruz projects.
And then for me, this is Alyssa, we don't have any specific plans at the moment, although we're really interested both at looking at some of the issues we weren't able to explore in the LA project, and would it be, we know that it would be really different looking at some of the other places of interest that we have. I also should mention here that my program at the Nature Conservancy has kind of expanded our focus from coastal resilience to more general disaster resilience. And we're really trying to think through some of these equity questions a little bit broader when we look at both kind of broader flood risk as well as fire risk. I know that, I don't know if everyone saw, there's been some interesting articles recently about kind of the link between disaster relief and equity, that most of the funding tends to go to higher income people, and understanding like what are some of the issues there in terms of disaster relief. But yeah, please reach out if you think that, we'd love to see if anyone uses this data and it's helpful, and how we could kind of take the next step either here in LA or in other communities as well.
Yeah, just to add quickly too, we had a meeting with a lady at the planning department in Santa Monica after the project. She was part of the focus group where she was really interested in the jobs connection. It wasn't necessarily, specific to coastal habitats and the social values they provide, but she found a lot of our workers come from city A, B, and C. So they were looking into another grant to try to improve, I think, transportation or whatever it was. So it was kind of a side unexpected benefit of what we did. So.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Jennifer, who's wondering, what were some of the most important ways that social vulnerability analysis affected the Santa Cruz Climate Action Plan?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Just to be clear, the social vulnerability analysis was actually integrated into our Climate Adaptation Plan update. So we do have separate action and adaptation plans. Just wanted to make that clear. I've already mentioned a couple ways that we have cited in that document on how we are already or we're considering utilizing this information. But quite frankly, this work really opened up, I think, for not only our climate action program, which I lead, but our city as a whole. How can we be more inclusive and more equitable in this kind of work? To support our climate adaptation plan, we conducted over 51 of outreach events across the community, where over 20% of them were in these socially vulnerable communities or with these socially vulnerable communities. This also opened up the opportunity for us to start to explore other communities that could be considered vulnerable, and we were able to integrate into the adaptation plan consideration of LGBTQ communities who, due to reasons of potential questions about documentation and so forth, could also be considered socially vulnerable to some of these climate change risks. So again, kind of expanding the conversation. And I have to say that equity is a key feature in these Resilient Coast Santa Cruz projects that are starting very shortly as well. So that's really kind of some of the outcomes and what was integrated into the adaptation plan.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Tiffany. All right. I don't see any other questions coming in, so I think we can wrap up here. Thank you so much to our presenters, to Alyssa, Giuliano, and Tiffany for joining us today. And thank you for all joining us today as attendees. Keep an eye out for a follow-up email from me with a whole bunch of links and a link to the recording as well. And please feel free to share those resources. And I'll also include a link to sign up for future webinar announcements in case you're not already on the list. We have a great one coming up later this month on Surfers Point that we'll be sending out an announcement for very shortly. But thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your week. Bye.
Thanks so much, Carrie.
Bye-bye.